The existence of suffering in the world is one of the most salient counterarguments to the traditional concept of a benevolent creator god. Humanity's metaphysical quest to understand the world we live in is forever dogged by the unpleasant fact that pain and suffering are a constant and universal feature of our reality. The interesting thing about modern secular societies is that the problem of suffering hasn't stopped being a metaphysical dilemma, despite the fact that there is no higher power to blame. Instead, humanity itself is put on trial for this crime. There are huge swaths of the population who believe that ending suffering is not only desirable, but feasible. Political and cultural institutions are built around the goal of eradicating all war, all inequality, all discomfort, and all disagreement. Of course, to achieve this grand utopia would require a global iron fist, which controlled our every thought and action, which would inevitably lead to its own kind of suffering. But the practical difficulties aren't what's relevant for us here, because even if it were possible to eradicate suffering, we would be fools to do so. Although we try to run from suffering, we actually benefit from it. We'll start with the concept of catabasis. Catabasis is the Greek word for the descent into the underworld. It is one form of the hero's journey, as popularized by Joseph Campbell. Popular stories of Catabasis include Orpheus descending into the underworld to rescue Eurydice, Alice's fall into Wonderland, and the story of Jesus is a type of Catabasis as well, where God descends from his holy realm to incarnate as a man who suffers alongside us before ascending once again. We can think of this journey as an inverted ladder, where the hero, in order to rise to new heights, must first journey downwards to new lows. In this sense, suffering is the terrifying and holy wall of fire we must pass through if we want to progress. This formulation works very well for types of suffering we can make sense of. The obstacle becomes the stepping stone towards a greater understanding. It's a wonderful approach and speaks volumes for the impact one's mindset can have on our ability to overcome challenges. But what about meaningless suffering? A woman is recently married and pregnant. They get into a car crash where the father dies and the baby is lost. How does this help her? How is one to suggest that she should use this occasion as a stepping stone to reach new heights? It doesn't make sense. Honestly, it would be incredibly rude to try to convince her that this is actually all to her benefit. Meaningless suffering is sublime, in the sense that it conjures feelings of profound fear and awe. We are horrified, but captivated by its presence. The idea of catabasis can still help someone make sense of this type of suffering, but to the person undergoing such trauma, it is likely of little consolation because in reality, that person is unlikely to be improved by the situation. They descend, but in the returning ascent, they are lower than where they started. All the same, they can become stronger for it, and future challenges will feel easier because of it. We'll return to this later on. Let's move on to the next one. No discussion of suffering is complete without talking about Friedrich Nietzsche. In the first few pages of Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche has a wonderful allegory called The Three Metamorphoses, which tells how the spirit becomes a camel, then a lion, and then a child. At the beginning of the journey, the spirit is like the camel who kneels down to be loaded up with the stuff of life that's most difficult. The low-paying jobs, the fair-weather friends, the death of a parent. All the troubles that life can offer are loaded onto the camel's back, and it speeds off into the desert, packed with everything it managed to carry. There, in the desert, the camel becomes a lion, whose strength is equal to the weight the camel carried. The greater the camel's burden, the stronger the lion becomes. And in the desert, the lion is confronted by the dragon known as Thou Shalt. And on each scale of this dragon is written the words, Thou Shalt. Nietzsche lived during the Victorian era, which was the counter-revolution against the libertarian ethics of the Enlightenment. The form that the dragon took in his culture seems ridiculous to us today. It was a time of sexual repression and strong moral duty. Our society's mores and taboos are quite different from the 19th century, but if you take a look around, we are just as repressed as they were, only in different ways. The dragon today has scales that read, Thou shalt not offend. Thou shalt take up as little space as possible. Thou shalt support the right political movements, and thou shalt not question us, and so on. The scales will be different depending on your culture. The lion uses his strength to resound a sacred no to destroy the dragon. I imagine many of you who are watching are uncomfortable with the proposition, but it is necessary, according to Nietzsche, to, quote, find illusion and caprice even in the most sacred, end quote. When the dragon is slain, the lion becomes a child who issues forth the sacred yes. As Nietzsche describes it, quote, the spirit now wills his own will, and he who had been lost to the world now conquers his own world, end quote. The story is relevant because it is through suffering that the camel grows into a strong lion. If the camel shrugs off the load meant for him, he becomes weak. He has made the journey harder because he has preferred comfort to struggle. How can he destroy the dragon if he does not know how to shoulder the burden? Both of these approaches to suffering are from a different era. They are profound, and we're going to continue using them here, but for those of you who want to explore these ideas in a more contemporary form, I would recommend the two books Anti-Fragility and The Coddling of the American Mind. Both books approach the issue from different angles, but they are incredibly insightful to the real-world implications that stem from avoiding suffering. But now that we have a general overview, what do we do with it? How can we take these abstract ideas and apply them to our real life? After all, there's not an actual dragon we can go meet, and there's no gateway to the underworld on GPS. I think it's important to keep in mind that there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this problem. Suffering is a dynamic experience. There is acute suffering, meaning it happens once and is done. And then there is chronic suffering, which is less sharp but sticks around like a low hum. There is personal suffering, communal suffering, and global suffering. There are many layers to this beast, and it is your responsibility to apply the framework which is most relevant to the situation, like a martial artist who changes his stance in response to his challenger. There are two frameworks that I want to talk about. One for acute suffering and one for chronic suffering. Chronic suffering makes the least sense to us because it is often very difficult to identify what is happening. It is like a miasma of unease, an existential ennui, with vague boundaries and wispy shadows off in the distance. This environment is all around us, but we are blind to it because our society teaches us to ignore it. We have antidepressants to shut our minds to its presence, movies and video games which act as blinders to its monstrous terrain, and drugs and alcohol which lull us to sleep on its poisonous ground. We think we are solving the problem by dulling the pain, but we aren't. If your hand is on a hot stove and it burns, we know it by the pain it produces. This pain is a message. The pain of chronic suffering is less direct, more subtle, and therefore less intelligible. But it is a message all the same. If we allow ourselves to feel this pain, we begin to see this inner world we normally shut our minds to. As we begin to learn how to see in this place, we can then learn how to navigate within it. This isn't a physical movement like walking, but a terribly slow traversal of mental space, which we influence through our habits. If we allow ourselves to feel the finer details of this suffering and begin to move, blindly at first, we can use the changes we feel in our mental state as a type of sight for our psychological and spiritual well-being. Let's take this out of abstraction. Let's say you're into partying. You drink a lot, do drugs regularly, you don't exercise, and have a poor diet. If you drop into your pain here, it will feel shitty, and you'll want to leave. So you drink or whatever to stop feeling it. But if you drop into your pain and don't allow yourself to leave, the pain will eventually become uncomfortable enough that you either break and go back to partying, or you begin to move towards something that feels better, like exercise, a better sleep cycle, forming deeper connections with friends and family. You get the idea. In this sense, suffering is a type of sense perception for your inner world. Eventually, you will stumble upon something that feels very different from what you felt before, like stepping on solid stone after having dredged your feet through a boggy marsh all your life. You step on and realize that it is a path. As you follow this path of sturdy, smooth stones, you begin to feel better and better. You look around at your friends and family and want them to step on this comforting stone, but they can't see it, and you can't do it for them. So you continue on, wishing there was a way to give it to them. At times you will stumble off, back into the marsh, but the pain will grow until you step back on again. And as you walk with increasingly sturdier steps, the people around you will notice. This is the meaning behind the wounded healer. By digging deep into the wound, you are given the sight to move forward. As the famous Sufi poet Rumi once said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." In many ways, acute suffering is easier to approach because it is only a moment of pain, and then it is gone. The important thing to keep in mind with this type of suffering is that much depends on how we relate to it. If we resist it or attempt to avoid it, we are doing ourselves a disservice. The wall of fire is a favorite symbol of mine. There are thin walls and thick walls, walls which tingle and walls which burn. We should face the wall with courage and walk into it, knowing that although one day this wall will kill you, today it will make you stronger. There is a contingent of Western society which deludes itself into thinking we don't need to pass through this wall, but that is a delusion. The world demands sacrifice. The only way out is through. When we resist, we prolong the inevitable and grow weaker and more infantile in the process. A great real-world example of this is the giant sequoias. When it was created in 1916, the National Park Service had a policy of suppressing all fires around the redwood forests. They wanted to protect the trees as best they could. But as the years went by, the rangers noticed that no new sequoias were sprouting. Little did they know, the trees only released their seeds after a fire had swept through the area. In their pursuit to protect these forests, the underbrush continued to grow and grow. So when a fire finally did come through, it was so intense that it burned everything to the ground, instead of clearing out the underbrush and allowing the seeds to fall on fertile ground. Our lives are like the life cycle of the forest. If we resist suffering, we become weak and vulnerable, so that when a fire finally does come through, we are consumed instead of strengthened. Suffering is not just acceptable, it is fundamental to our survival. We must learn how to suffer in ways that strengthen us, so that when tough times come around, we have the fortitude to face it. Don't look around and point out how weak everyone else is. Take a look in the mirror and root out the weakness in you. The real crux of the matter is this: do you deny life or do you affirm it? If you reject suffering, embrace comfort, and demand change from the world to accommodate you, you are denying life. If you accept suffering, temper your comfort, and ask how you can be of service to the world, you are affirming life in all its messy complexity. Reject the death cult which would bend the world to its whims. Embrace the holy fire of divine life and allow its flames to strengthen you from within. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Helps me out with the algorithm. See you in the next one.